Throughout American history, the dark shadow of assassination attempts on its presidents weaves a complex tapestry of motives and madness. Beyond political dissatisfaction and ideological conflict, some of these instances stem from the depths of personal delusion and absolute absurdity. In this video, we will uncover the most bizarre reasons that propelled individuals to point a gun at the nation's leaders. From someone who believed the president owed him money to another convinced that his stomach pains were the president's fault. These stories reflect the unexpected intersections of mental turmoil and historical trajectory.
Recuperación económica y
Number 10. Sarah Jane Moore, Gerald Ford.
I knew that that's the only shot I would have was a headshot. He came out, looked right at me, and after I fired the shot...
At first glance, Sarah Jane Moore appeared to be a completely normal woman. She grew up in an entirely average home, attended nursing school, trained as an accountant, married and divorced 5 times, and had 4 children. However, in her 40s, she seemingly became an FBI informant, according to how things unfolded. It seems the feds identified her as having very extreme leftist political views and asked her to infiltrate radical left-wing terrorist organizations to try to gather information on Patty Hearst, who was allegedly part of an organization named the Symbionese Liberation Army. All this came to a head on September 22, 1975, as President Ford emerged from the St. Francis Hotel with his bodyguards, surrounded by a crowd. Suddenly, Sarah Moore leaped from the crowd and fired at the president from a distance of 40 feet, pressing the trigger. As she fired, a man who was nearby lunged and diverted the gun to the side. The bullet missed the president, who jumped from the noise of the shot and hit the wall behind him. Secret Service agents immediately grabbed the president and dragged him to the limousine, lying on him until he said, "I'm going to choke. It's an armored car. Get off me." As President Ford fled the scene, absolute panic reigned at the site. The bullet that hit the wall disintegrated, and a fragment from it struck a taxi driver who was standing nearby. The police arrested Sarah Moore, and all she said in her initial interrogation was, "What a bummer. If I had my .44, I would have succeeded in hitting him."
Cold, and I did have time for a second shot, had never planned for a second shot, had practiced and was psyched for one shot.
Later, the real reason for the assassination attempt emerged. 4 months before the incident, her handler completely cut off contact with her, which worried her and led her to think that the government wanted to kill her. So she decided to take matters into her own hands, causing a violent outbreak that would force the government to back down from Vietnam. Number 9. Francisco Martin Duran, Bill Clinton. Francisco Martin Duran was once a small and adorable child born in the city of Albuquerque, Mexico. He had 6 siblings, all from different fathers. Growing up, he enlisted in the military after being caught at 17 trying to take a spin on a forklift. The judge, taking pity on him and with his mother's blessing, sent him to the military instead of jail. He was trained as a medic and served in Hawaii. During this period, he fell in love, got married, and had a son. One day, Francisco and his friends went bowling and got into an argument with some people outside the venue. In a fit of anger, Francisco got into a car and drove into the crowd. He was sentenced to 2 years in military prison and was released. On Saturday, October 29, 1994, Francisco drove to Washington with a clear intention: to kill the president. He wandered near the White House fences, pondering his next move. Suddenly, he saw a group of people standing and talking among themselves. He looked closer and thought he saw President Clinton among them. Immediately, he opened fire towards them, shooting 30 bullets from an automatic rifle. The bullets hit the walls and windows. Nobody was injured. In court, Francisco attempted to claim insanity by stating that his reason for the act was to save the world from an alien fog that was connected to an alien's umbilical cord in Colorado. The court rejected his insanity plea and sent him to prison. Number 8. Richard Paul Pavlik, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
That in historical research, there may be a dimension similar to the quantum dimension in physical reality.
When one hears the name JFK, the immediate thought usually goes to Lee Harvey Oswald. But few know that there was another person who attempted to assassinate the president before him. Richard Paul Pavlik was a solitary figure. After serving in the military during World War I, Richard worked at the post office in Boston, and later continued working in Belmont. He was a bachelor known in the community for his angry opinions about the government. One day, Richard decided he was going to kill the president. And how, you ask? With a bomb, of course. Tired of life, Richard decided to commit suicide and take JFK with him. He went out and bought sticks of dynamite, connected them with wire, and planned to blow himself up along with JFK. The Secret Service became aware of his plan because Richard was not secretive about his intentions at all. He began to follow JFK's travels across the country, regularly sending letters to his work manager in Belmont with texts like, "The town will soon hear great things from me." Due to the strange content of the letters, the work manager looked at the stamps and saw they matched the president's locations throughout the country. He immediately contacted the police, who informed the Secret Service, and they quickly apprehended him. During his interrogation, it was revealed that his plan was to stay with the dynamite in his car and, when he had the chance, to crash into the president's limousine and detonate the vehicle. It was also revealed that he had an opportunity to do so, but postponed it because, in his words, "Kennedy was with his wife and children, and I didn't want to harm her or the kids." In court, it was determined that he suffered from insanity, and he was sent to a psychiatric institution. Number 7. Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez, Barack Obama.
It is so crucial that the world hears God's word for the fate of humanity, for the fate of mankind.
21-year-old Oscar Ramiro, residing in Idaho Falls, Idaho, was particularly paranoid and suspicious, constantly claiming that the government was after him and wanted to kill him. He even recorded a video for Oprah in an attempt to appear on her television show to discuss what he perceived as the country's problems. On October 23, 2011, Oscar informed his family that he was traveling to Utah for a business trip. After failing to respond to calls and completely disappearing, his family filed a missing person report. On November 9th, Oscar arrived in Washington, and the very day he got there, the police stopped him for a routine check but didn't detain him as there was no reasonable suspicion. On November 11th at 9 p.m., Oscar parked his car on Constitution Avenue, opened the car window, and fired from a distance of 700 meters towards the south side of the White House. Several bullets hit a second-floor window but did not penetrate the bulletproof glass. The rest hit the building's concrete. Fortunately, the President and the First Lady were not in the house at that time but were on a trip to Australia, although their daughter Sasha was at home at the time but was unharmed. Secret Service agents, hearing the shots, quickly responded and began scans for possible snipers, but found nothing, and thought the noise came from a nearby construction site. 4 days later, the holes in the house walls were discovered, and by then, Oscar was already wanted by the police because, after the shooting, he crashed his car on a nearby street, abandoned his vehicle, and left the weapon in the car. He was captured, and during his interrogation, he said he did it because he believed Barack Obama was the devil, and he needed to make marijuana legal. He was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment.
It's a coincidence that I look like Jesus. I am the modern-day Jesus Christ that you all have been waiting for.
Number 6. Lynette Squeaky Fromm, Gerald Ford. Lynette Fromm was born into a completely ordinary family on October 22, 1967. She grew up and went to college. At the age of 19, she dropped out of college due to a family dispute, left home, and traveled to Venice Beach. Sitting on a bench, she suddenly saw Charles Manson. He spoke to her, and she joined the Manson family, which would later become a story in its own right. On the morning of September 5, 1975, Fromm went to Capitol Park in Sacramento to talk to the president about the state of the forests. As she approached the president, she drew a semi-automatic pistol and pressed the trigger. Fortunately, the gun did not fire, and Secret Service agents immediately jumped on her as she screamed, "It didn't shoot. Can you believe it? It didn't shoot." When asked in interrogation why she did it, she answered, "I wanted to protest what happened to Charlie and the girls," referring to the Charles Manson case. She was sentenced to life in prison and was released in 2009. Number 5. Charles Guiteau, James Garfield.
With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, we shall bind up the nation's wounds and cherish peace.
What do people do when they're unemployed? It turns out Charles Guiteau decided to become a presidential assassin. He worked as a clerk in a law firm and wanted to become a lawyer, but failed the exam. Then, Charles decided to become a speechwriter for politicians. The first speech he wrote was for a politician named Grant. To cut a long story short, the speech was a failure. Grant delivered the speech, and it was so bad that he lost the debate and retired. Later, in the 1881 presidential election, a Republican candidate named James Garfield won and became the 20th President of the United States. Subsequently, Charles swapped the name in the speech to Garfield's and credited Garfield's election victory to the speech he wrote. Proudly, he would stand on the street and recite the speech to passers-by. Charles believed that Garfield won thanks to the excellent speech he had written for him, and requested that Garfield appoint him as the U.S. ambassador to Vienna or France. Needless to say, he received a negative response and was outright rejected, which angered him greatly. Charles, who was unemployed at the time, bought a revolver. After a period of practice, he began to follow the president until he found an opportunity at a train station in Washington where he shot him. The president died 2 months later, and Charles was hanged 5 months after that. Number 4, John Hinckley, Jr., Ronald Reagan.
I worked hard. I walked the line for 41 years and did everything I needed to do to get my freedom.
John Hinckley grew up in Texas, the son of the CEO and president of the Vanderbilt Energy Corporation. He attended Texas Tech University but dropped out after some time. Later, John moved to Los Angeles in an attempt to become a songwriter, but his efforts were unsuccessful. He then returned to his parents' home and began practicing with firearms. One day, John became obsessed with the movie Taxi Driver, released in 1976, in which the character Travis Bickle, portrayed by Robert De Niro, plots to assassinate a president. John fell in love with actress Jodie Foster, who appeared in the film. He began writing her love songs and letters, calling all the time, sending messages. Failing to make contact with Foster, he decided to impress her with the extreme act of assassinating a president, thinking that would finally make her notice him. Initially, John followed the then-president Jimmy Carter, but was arrested in Nashville for carrying firearms and returned home. Sometime later, John decided to try again, this time targeting Ronald Reagan. On March 28th, John arrived in Washington, D.C. by bus and went to the Washington Hilton Hotel, where Reagan was scheduled to speak to the media. At 2:30 p.m., as Reagan, escorted by Secret Service agents, was leaving to give a short speech outside the hotel before heading off in a waiting limousine, John, not knowing if he would ever get a better opportunity, shouted, "Mr. President." As Reagan turned his head, John pulled out a gun and emptied the magazine, firing 6 shots in succession. Luckily for Reagan, the first bullet did not hit him but struck the head of White House Press Secretary James Brady, passing above his left eye and hitting his brain. A District of Columbia police officer immediately turned around upon hearing the gunfire and was hit by the second bullet in the spine, falling to the ground. At that moment, John had a clear shot at the president, but standing in his way was a civilian named Alfred Antonucci, who struck him on the head and began wrestling him to the ground. Hearing the shots, Special Agent in Charge Jerry Parr grabbed Reagan by the shoulders and threw him towards the rear door of the limousine. Agent Ray Shattuck was right behind him and helped him jump into the limousine with the president. The third bullet flew toward the president, but instead hit a window of a building across the street. Parr's actions likely saved Reagan from a direct headshot. As Parr pushed Reagan into the limousine, Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy turned towards the source of the firing and positioned himself in the line of fire, spreading his arms and legs to shield Reagan and Parr, making himself a target. Tim was hit in the lower abdomen by the fourth bullet, which passed through his right lung, diaphragm, and right lobe of his liver. The fifth bullet hit the bulletproof glass of the open rear door of the limousine as Reagan and Parr were behind it. The sixth and final bullet passed between the open rear door space and the car frame, hitting the president in the left underarm. The bullet ricocheted off a rib and lodged in his lung, causing it to partially collapse before stopping less than an inch, 25 mm, from his heart. Moments after the initial shots, Secret Service agent Dennis McCarthy dove across the sidewalk and landed directly on John, while others pushed him to the ground. Another citizen, Frank J. McNamara, joined Antonucci and began hitting John on the head with force. Later, Agent Dennis McCarthy had to punch two citizens to force them to release John. It was later revealed that John had written a letter to Foster 2 hours before the assassination attempt, saying he would abandon the idea of shooting Reagan the moment he won her heart, and could live with her forever. He was tried and found not guilty by reason of insanity, and was committed to a psychiatric institution where he spent more than 3 decades. In 2016, a judge determined John no longer posed a threat and he was released. Number 3, Richard Lawrence, Andrew Johnson.
Was something politically that really wasn't even supposed to exist. He was a Union-supporting Southern Democrat.
Richard Lawrence was born in England around the year 1800. His family emigrated to the United States when he was 12 years old. Richard's childhood appeared normal. He grew up and found work as a house painter. In his 30s, Richard began to exhibit signs of dissociative behavior and violent tendencies. Historians have speculated that his exposure to toxic materials such as lead every day contributed to his mental illness. Richard traveled back and forth between England and the United States until, at a certain point, he stayed in the United States and wrote to his family claiming that the United States owed him a debt because he was Richard III of England and had 2 estates and great wealth. Richard convinced himself that because of President Andrew Johnson, he was not receiving his money. Since people at the time referred to President Andrew as the King, Richard decided to assassinate Andrew to claim the money and become the King of the United States. On that fateful day, Richard approached the steps of the Capitol, aimed a pistol at Johnson's head, but he fired and missed. Before anyone could apprehend Richard, Johnson jumped on him and began to beat him vigorously with his cane. At that time, the Secret Service had not yet been established, and it turned out after the fact that Johnson didn't need them. Number 2, Giuseppe Zangara, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
I am not a stranger here, because for a good many years I used to come down here.
Giuseppe Zangara was born in Italy on September 7, 1900. He grew up, enlisted in the Royal Italian Army, and served in the Alps during World War I. After completing his military service in 1923, Zangara decided to pursue the American dream and found himself at the center of one of the most bewildering assassination attempts on a U.S. president. Zangara, who suffered from severe chronic stomach pains and presumably mental health issues, decided that his chronic stomach pains were due to President Roosevelt's American policies at the time, because why not? And determined that the best way to address this problem was to eliminate Franklin D. Roosevelt. On February 15, 1933, with a gun he purchased for $8, like snagging a Black Friday deal on a pistol, Zangara attempted to assassinate Roosevelt from a crowd listening to his speech in Miami. It seems his shooting skills were on par with his ability to deal with stomach pain. Not great. He missed Roosevelt but managed to injure 5 people, including Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who eventually died from his injuries. During his trial, Zangara sounded like he was coming off a script from a mediocre drama movie when he told the judge, "Don't be stingy, give me 100 years." Ultimately, Zangara received the electric chair, not a consolation prize for his stomach pains. So if you think your pains are bad, remember, at least you're not Zangara. Number 1, John Schrank, Theodore Roosevelt.
Just how much protection and security surrounds the president or even his challenger Mitt Romney?
Among all reasons for assassination attempts on U.S. presidents, it's hard to find one that clinches the "you won't believe what happened next" category. John Schrank, a former saloon keeper, attempted to take down Theodore Roosevelt, the former president, during a campaign stop in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The bullet Schrank fired made a journey through Roosevelt's steel eyeglass case and also through a thick copy of his speech, before finally lodging in Roosevelt's chest. All this, and Roosevelt still shouted to the crowd to remain calm and not to harm Schrank. As an experienced hunter and anatomist, Roosevelt correctly concluded that since he wasn't coughing up blood, the bullet hadn't reached his lungs. Hence, he chose to continue with his planned speech while bleeding into his shirt. "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," he told the gathered crowd, proving that even an assassination attempt couldn't stop him from delivering his message. But that's not the full story. Schrank, who was immediately grabbed by the crowd, almost faced a lynching had Roosevelt not called for calm and ensured Schrank was not harmed. This episode showcases Roosevelt in the most heroic light, maintaining his composure and even ensuring the safety of the man who tried to murder him. So, what was the reason behind the assassination attempt? A mystical sense of duty stemming from a dream where the spirit of William McKinley allegedly demanded vengeance, pointing at a picture of Theodore Roosevelt. And the outcome? Schrank was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to a psychiatric institution, while Roosevelt continued his campaign with a bullet stuck in his chest. If that's not enough to make this case one of the most ludicrous assassination attempts, it's hard to imagine what could be. In this video, we've delved into the strangest reasons that propelled individuals to point a gun at the nation's leaders. As we've explored cases from a man convinced the president owed him money to another blaming his stomach pains on presidential policies, these narratives unveil the bizarre intersections where tumultuous minds meet historical pathways.